Great. Thanks so much, Sherry, for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here and making time in your day. I had an awesome session last night or yesterday evening with your colleagues and really appreciated the questions that I got. I certainly invite any and all questions, critiques, thoughts, and we'll certainly save time for those at the end. I also just really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share this work with you and hopefully give you some new or expanded ways of thinking about how we can best support our learners across the continuum of their education, but certainly around the transition periods by supporting their healthy, self-conscious emotions. So I'm going to use some slides to get started. I, I always finally have a disclosure. It took me over a decade to get one. I just want to briefly mention that Sherry mentioned we do a little bit of consulting work at the Shame Lab, and we've done some work for which we've been paid around helping them develop actually a medical malpractice firm up in New York to develop training for their physician network. And then, of course, I get paid for talks here and there. None of that will affect what I tell you today, but I did just want to disclose it. I also want to make a really important acknowledgement here to the artist who produced most of the illustrations that I'm going to use in my talk. Hannah is he's just a great friend of ours at the Shame Lab and just such a talented woman. Also someone that just gets shame. She understands it and she understands how to put it into multiple dimensions through her art. And you'll I think get a great appreciation of how talented she is as we go through this talk. The goals for today are the objectives. I'd like for you to leave here following this exploration of shame and transition periods with the ability to define what this emotion is and why it can be potent during transition periods in particular. I want you to understand some of the drivers of shame during transition periods and how we can begin to acknowledge them more openly, and then to be able to define the framework that we use for implementing action regarding shame, and that we call shame competence. And then finally, and most importantly, I want you to walk away with some specific strategies, things you can begin doing, new ways of looking at the experience of learning medicine that hopefully will support your learners through healthy transitions, particularly emotionally. So I'm going to start with a personal story. I always do this because it is such a personal topic. And if we can't connect with our own experiences of shame, whether in ourselves or in the world around us, I think we will continue to be very limited in our ability to talk about it. So I always start with my own story. It's also a story that happened in a transition period, and it's the story that led to all this work. I never set out to be what someone called me the other day, you're the shame guy in medicine. I never said I want to be a shame guy in anywhere. And it's because I fell kind of face first into it. And this is the story of how I did that. We use the metaphor of fire a lot to help us understand shame and work with shame. And if you think about shame as a fire, then this was the match strike. And it occurred during a time that provided a very important context for this story. So that context was one in which I was an early second year family medicine resident coming through a transition period out of intern year and into one with greater responsibility, being looked at to have and carry that responsibility competently, but not yet having the skill set necessary to do it consistently. And that's a really challenging, if not universal, place for a medical learner to be at times in their education. I was also working on a labor and delivery unit that was not very friendly. It was not a place where vulnerability was practiced or encouraged. There was a lot of posturing. It was an eat your young kind of environment, and it just was not, frankly, a very safe place to be learning or to be practicing or to be struggling. And in the midst of this environment and this transition period, I was engaging in a self-evaluation, and we constantly self-evaluate, all of us. It's something that our big brains allow us to do. And my self-evaluation was one of self-doubt. It was one of wondering if I had the skills to be good enough at the position, wondering whether I belonged in that environment, wondering whether I needed to change things about myself to better fit in with the sort of the cultural norms of that environment, which were much different than some of the other places where I worked in my program. This ranged from what I would consider kind of healthy humility to imposterism, where I really had all the evidence that would suggest I could be successful in this new role, but I didn't believe it. And that was just a pervasive sense of self-doubt. So that was the backdrop under which the match struck the box and lit. And when it lit, it was the end of a 24-hour shift. I was tired. I was getting ready to go home, and a patient came in very abruptly, having a placental abruption. And as you may know, that's an obstetrical emergency where the blood supply to the baby is acutely threatened. And this baby was in distress. It was actually, the head was almost beginning to crown. And so someone above my pay grade made the decision to do a vacuum assisted delivery and then pull me in the room as an opportunity to practice. So a vacuum is where you attach a little vacuum suction cup to the baby's head and you actually help pull the baby out as mom pushes. And there was a real sense of urgency to get the baby out. The room was very chaotic. There were lots of people. And there I found myself at the foot of the bed delivering this baby. Again, without a lot of skills, yet carrying a lot of responsibility. And I delivered the baby successfully, which was the saving grace of the story, honestly. I don't know what would have happened had the baby been harmed. But unfortunately, in the process, I caused a really, really severe maternal injury. And it was a laceration that was far more complex and problematic than what you would expect with an assisted delivery like this. And it was one of those experiences where, immediately, something just went wrong, and everyone around something went wrong. And if I put myself back in my shoes, then I just remember kind of the hushed silence of the room that seemed to quickly take hold, and feeling just intensely exposed. If the imagery in my mind going back there is one where there must have been like a semicircle of people around the bed, it felt like, the head of which is the patient, who can't feel anything because she's got an epidural, thankfully. But I just remember seeing people's eyes, and their eyes were shocked, or they were disappointed, or they were horrified, or they were let down. And I just remember the real sense of judgment that they revealed. And there was a fight or flight response in me. There was fear and anxiety. One of our research participants one time said it feels like my guts fall out on the floor when I feel, this emotion, and that's how it felt for me. And I had this just very primitive and very uncharacteristic for me urge to just disappear, to get out of the room. And because the floor couldn't just swallow me up like I wanted it to, I just handed the baby and the vacuum off to the obstetrician who took over, and I just kind of quietly left the room. And I got outside, and it was just the only thing in this very disoriented, depersonalized state that I knew to do was just to get away from the room as soon and as far as possible. And I found myself then on the other side of the hospital in a meditation room of all places, kind of in the corner of the room behind a chair, just sitting head in hands. And this is where the emotional experience transitioned into something a lot more challenging and difficult. Now, if you were the outside observer watching me go through this, you would see probably some sort of an emotional reaction, which I actually hid pretty well in the room. You might see me leave. If you had come and sat with me, which only one person did after the error, you would have seen my distress. And then you would have said, "Oh, he's fine." The fire went out. He came back to work the next day. Yes, maybe a little bit reserved and quiet, but didn't seem worse for the wear. And in reality, what I was experiencing internally, but not able to share with anyone, was, the equivalent of a brush fire, a forest fire, emotionally. That experience of the fight or flight, what we call the affective upswell, it transitioned once I had the more cognitive resources available to start thinking about what that experience meant for me. It then ushered in questions like, well, not even questions. They weren't questions anymore. They were statements. It wasn't, "Are you good enough?" It was, "You aren't good enough." It wasn't, "Do you belong here?" It was, "You don't belong here. You're not trustworthy. You hurt people. You're a bad doctor. You don't deserve the responsibilities given to you." And it was like this just cascading, relentless internal self-talk about my global badness for hurting someone. And it really kind of erased, months or a year plus of building credibility in my program in my mind. It was just all gone in an instant. So this was a really distressing experience, and it really caught me off guard. Um, it threw me way off for days. I mean, I managed to get through the work days, barely. And then it just kept pervading over and over. And, um, eventually I realized I got to do something about this. And I reached out to my best friend in the program, still my best friend today. He's still in the military. And we went out to brunch, and I sat down. I was like, I got to tell you about what happened to me and what I did. And I want to know your thoughts. And it was so confusing to try to tell him what actually happened with the laceration that we're sitting at brunch in DC, and busy brunch cafe or something. And I had to get a napkin and fashion a vagina out of the napkin and take like a dinner roll and deliver the roll through the napkin like a baby's head to show him exactly what happened, because it was so bizarre of an outcome. And I remember in that moment, just the act of telling him about it uh, was such a relief, but then laughing a little bit about it and the absurdity of that situation. And then most critically, having him listen intently, listen, not try to make me feel better, but just listen, validate what I was going through, and then say, I know this was terrible, but I don't think this is about you. I think this is about something you did, and I think that could have happened to me. And I think it could have happened to anybody. And, he began to kind of list off all the things that may have contributed to that were outside of me and something wrong with me internally and globally. And for the first time, even though I'd had a couple of those thoughts before, I was able to believe it. And that was unbelievably transformational in that experience. It didn't dissolve all the negative emotion about hurting someone, but it oriented me more towards things that I could actually begin working on and trying to fix, and not just my own sort of obsessive thinking about my own badness. And that began my recovery. Along the way, I did some soul searching, got out of a kind of a crappy relationship where I had some feelings of inadequacy, did even more soul searching, and eventually came across, the concept of shame, introduced first through Brene Brown in one of her TED Talks. And it was like this huge curtain went up. Like I put on a pair of glasses and I could just see my own experiences with so much more clarity. And with those same glasses, I began looking at the world around me, the learning environments, the patient care and clinical experiences I was having, watching how people interacted, and I started to see shame all around me. I also went into the medical literature where I was beginning to sort of develop some academic interests, found a lot of information about shame in psychology, and I found a lot of signal for shame in the med ed literature, but hardly any explicit acknowledgement of the emotion and very, very little direct research attending to it. And what that led me to realize, and has continued to, convince me, is that as I looked around in both these places for this and didn't find it yet, felt it and, saw it and could sense it, but no one was talking about it, was the notion of what I call the present absence of shame in medicine and medical education. It's an emotion that is present. We feel it. And I'm going to tell you in a little bit why we feel it. It's having an effect. It's influencing our experiences deeply, significantly, but we don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge it. We don't share it. We don't research it. So there's an absence of attention and conversation and forums to begin addressing its presence, and then importantly, to begin working with its presence in constructive and healthy ways, which is what we're all about in the work we do. Ultimately, this realization led to, through the help of some fantastic mentors and amazing opportunities, both inside and outside of the military, a dissertation that examined qualitatively how medical learners experience shame across the continuum of medical education. So 3 studies, 4 papers, and a collection of other papers. I'm actually going to share the link to this, and I'm sharing a link to the dissertation solely because I reference it later in the talk, because it's just too hard to reference all the individual papers. Also, if you just have someone you want to torture and want to send that link to read, they can take a crack at it. It's pretty dense. But this was a really important project to go through to develop deeper understandings of this emotion and in the ways it's manifesting in medical learners. So as we did this research and as I talk about this, I am always sort of careful to provide a definition of shame that gets us on the same page about what we're talking about. And it's not that this is the only way to understand shame. In fact, I'm going to present a broader conceptualization in a minute, but I want to make sure that you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shame, and then reflect on how it aligns with your understandings. So, as shame is largely defined in psychology, and this is a bit of an amalgamated definition, at its core, it's a negative self-conscious emotion, so an emotion that occurs when we self-evaluate, in which we deem ourselves to be globally flawed or deficient or unworthy in some way. It's often precipitated by a triggering event, but not always. It can be a more chronic sort of disposition that we have rather than kind of an acute emotional event that occurs. That global sense of inadequacy, of negative self-evaluation is the hallmark of shame. So when we feel shame, we say things like, I am bad, I am flawed, I'm incompetent. The other major component I want to highlight about shame is that it some would argue always has an element of feeling negative judgment. And that's negative judgment from other people. And those people could be real, the people surrounding me around the patient's bed, or they could be projections of our imagination, people that we imagine are watching us and looking at us. And then we apply judgments through those imagined eyes. And I certainly have done that too. I do it actually all the time now. If I'm having a tough moment with my kids and I'm losing, I'm having a certain tone of voice or kind of getting frustrated, I find myself wondering what someone looking out the window next door would be thinking about me as I'm doing that. There's nobody there, but I am projecting them in my imagination and then evaluating myself through their eyes. That negative judgment, particularly around something global of the self, is the hallmark of shame. Now, shame is also a broad construct, and through the work I'm doing with Luna Dolezal, my colleague, I'll introduce in a few minutes, Luna's helped me understand the value of not being too narrow in our conceptualizations of shame, because shame does encompass a number of different affective experiences. And so we also work with this concept of the shame umbrella, and it captures experiences that sometimes are easier to talk about or recognize, such as being humiliated or disrespected, ridiculed, put down, embarrassed, slandered, etc. What each of these has in common is the perception of negative judgment, and typically about something about us, the whole person, as well as some of their effects of putting us into a lower position of power, of self, etc. So I hope this gives some understanding of what we're talking about with shame, while at the same time not being too narrow with the way we're defining it. The last thing I'll tell you about just the nuts and bolts of shame that I think is really critical when we think about how this applies to the work we do in a complex organization is to talk about its distributed nature. And this is something Luna and I have been working with and grappling with and trying to make impact with this emotion within an organizational setting. So shame is a uniquely individual emotion. It occurs within us as we self-evaluate, and only we can deem ourselves to be flawed or deficient or unworthy. I mean, that can be influenced by the environment around us, but only we can feel the way we feel about ourselves. So it is a uniquely individual emotion, and it's idiosyncratic in its individuality. No two people are going to experience shame the same way. But while shame does have a major individual and cognitive dimension to it, it also has a very potent and important relational dimension. Shame comes about through our interactions with others. It is something that helps govern our social behaviors with other people. It's often the avoidance of shame that drives our behaviors, not just the shame itself. Shame can circulate among people. It can circulate on a team. It can circulate often down a hierarchy or down or across power differentials. So it has a very important relational component to it. And some would argue it is always a relational emotion because of that imagined or real other person and their judgment. But shame also has something, even more sort of broad than that, which is its institutional dimension. It can become embedded in our policies and our practices the ways in which we lay out our spaces, the cultural norms that we establish. And it's not just that shame is embedded, but it's the tendency to cause shame that can be embedded in these policies and practices and material conditions. So, for example, the Morbidity and Mortality Conference is a tried and true practice of the medical education profession that can cause significant shame depending on how it's executed. Remediation practices, hiring policies, state medical board proceedings, all of those have the potential to have shame embedded, and in many cases they do. And then finally, and sort of most broadly, shame is a societal emotion. It has a very powerful societal dimension. Shame shows up in marginalization, in oppression, in power, in conflict, in war. It's often, Luna describes it as the affective arm of those broader societal forces. It's what makes people feel unworthy or not good enough or powerless because of a mechanism like marginalization or racism or oppression. So shame is deeply embedded in our social structures, and it can be embedded in our ideologies, so much so that we don't even realize its existence. So this is overwhelming. It's entirely overwhelming when we work with shame, because if we're going to really make change with this emotion in constructive ways, we have to attend to its dimensions at multiple levels, which means that we have to work with it at multiple levels. And I'll tell you in a little bit how we're doing that. Okay, I'll bring you to the fifth dimension in just a few minutes. There's one other to tell you about. Another metaphor I want to introduce, because I can't help myself and kind of think and dream and talk in metaphors, is one that is overused, but is so apropos here, and it's the metaphor of an iceberg. Our understanding and our conceptualizations and our conversations around well-being and the lack thereof in healthcare are deeply anchored in experiences that we can measure, principle of which is burnout, and those that we can more easily talk about, either because they've been things we talked about, because they've been described well, because they're not stigmatized, et cetera. And that's led to conversations, for example, around transition periods that are largely weighted in the stress that they can cause, the burnout that can be associated with it, even the suicidality, which we can more easily identify, is tragic and as awful as it is. What our conceptualizations are lacking profoundly is understanding of, awareness of, and conversation about the experiences like shame that are not so easily talked about, that are stigmatized, that are taboo, that are really, really personal, for which we don't have easy tools to measure it. And we don't have entire conferences about its existence. These experiences are critically important, yet in line with that present absence concept are not attended to the degree we need to make the type of progress we want on challenging issues like supporting the well-being of trainees during transition periods. This iceberg metaphor, I think, also works and applies when we think about what we're observing in medical learners, right? So above the water, above the surface, we see things like how they're performing. We see things like their competency development, their professionalism, what they're wearing, how they're talking, how they're interacting with patients and one another. We might see some signs of outward distress that we can identify. We might give them a scale that can tell us how they're doing or feeling, for things that we can measure. What we don't often see is the self-evaluative or self-conscious processes going on underneath the surface that, for reasons I'll explain, don't often come up. And some of those reasons are understandable and reasonable. When we've looked at shame and the nature of shame experiences in medical learners, transition periods come up over and over again. And we think it's because there are certain elements of the shame experience that drive it, that exacerbate it, that prolong it, that are particularly salient during transition periods, and that we've observed as being present in transition periods. And so some of these beneath the surface processes include the struggle with going from objective to subjective standards. This is particularly relevant in the transition from preclinical to clinical learning in med school, and then from med school to residency, where we had a participant say about being in a clinical environment where he was being constantly evaluated and given subjective feedback. He said, God, it's so hard. It feels like I'm just being measured more and more with less and less of a measuring stick. So the absence of scores, of of relative performance to others, of class ranks, of board exams, et cetera, which provide discrete markers of how I'm doing. Now those are gone, and I'm reliant now on information that's a lot messier. It's a lot more subjective. It might not be delivered very effectively. And I'm left trying to figure out not only how I'm doing, but how to feel about myself as I'm doing it. Right. And so what we find is that in the midst of that subjectivity, particularly if the information isn't presented very effectively or is, you know, negatively presented in terms of mistreatment, that self-worth can take a real hit, especially if that self-worth has become attached to performance over time. And that is something that we found widely across our data set, was what psychology describes as performance-based self-esteem, or that's the feeling of being worthy because I'm performing at a high level. And so worth and performance become linked, which is somewhat understandable. You know, we all probably have a degree of that. But over the course of education, with continued high performance, objectively in particular, comes continued self-worth. And then that relationship is carried into clinical learning environments, into residency, where struggle is inevitable, low performance is inevitable, and even in the midst of decent performance, the subjectivity around the communication of that performance is so challenging that self-worth then takes a hit. And another way to state this is that in order to continue maintaining self-worth, I have to continue performing at a very high level, which is impossible in the course of medical learning if we're doing it right. So this objective to subjective transition and its effects on self-evaluation are so important in understanding what's going on under the surface as learners transition from one phase to another in clinical training. Another is the fact that identity is constantly and majorly shifting at times across these transitions. I think this is probably the most significant from medical school to residency. I was a program director for many years, so I saw this firsthand. And the shift of going from who I was back here to trying to figure out who am I now in this new environment with these new sets of challenges can be really abrupt. And it can be especially abrupt for people who aren't represented in that environment, and who then have to find belonging that other people are afforded much more easily. But I really want to also highlight here, and this is one of the most important, I think, takeaways if you're going to take something away from this talk, is that we need to expand the conversation around identity to include self-esteem and self-worth. There's an umbrella concept for both of these from psychology called self-concept, and self-concept comprises identity plus self-esteem. So it's who am I, and then how do I feel about who I am? Who am I becoming? Professional identity formation, and then self-concept formation would say, who am I becoming and how do I feel about who I'm becoming? And what governs how I feel about myself? What governs from where I derive my self-worth? This is a question that we do not attend to very much in medical education. And I'm going to argue that it's critically important because those sources of self-esteem are constantly being negotiated. And that negotiation is constantly under duress. Many people come into medicine with feeling good about themselves because of relationships, because of hobbies, because of service, because of spirituality. And the necessities of learning medicine often force us to pare those down, to put them to the side, to make room for the increasing amount of self-worth that we derive from how we're doing as a learner, how we're doing as a clinician, a practicing physician down the road. That imbalance can be especially challenging when we're struggling at being a medical learner, struggling at being a physician, and the sources of self-worth we used to draw on to feel worthy are either no longer accessible, they're not prominent, they haven't been maintained, and now we have a precariousness in terms of how we feel about ourselves as we form this identity. So I think a huge part of the work of this concept is figuring out how do we support the broad-based self-esteem of our medical learners and understanding how our systems make that really difficult. And I'll give you some things to think about at the end. The part of the under the surface milieu is also the intense pressure to perform and the pressure to prove myself is worthy of being at the place I'm in now, of being in your residency program, of being in the surgical field, of being in this medical school to begin with, that I had to prove myself to you while I perform as I'm learning. And then finally, kind of linked to that is just the intense imposter syndrome that can exist and often does exist beneath the surface, especially in those early parts of a transition where I'm given responsibility, I'm looked to for answers, and I don't have or perceive that I have the skill set to do it competently yet. And then I can blame that on some system that let me in that it shouldn't have, some set of circumstances that got me where I am, and not the achievement that I've garnered along the way. This milieu is something we've got to begin talking about, understanding, and operationalizing in order to provide the level of support during transitions that our learners most need. And that's because these things influence how they feel about themselves, how they see themselves, and that influences how they show up, how they engage, their well-being, their learning, their relationships, both constructively and less constructively. And I'll talk a little bit about the more constructive elements in a minute. It's not surprising that we don't talk about these things. It's not surprising that they remain beneath the surface. And it's because I think those conversations either don't happen, can't happen, or start to happen, and then they get sort of dulled out by the culture, by the busyness, by the demands of the world around us in medicine. I think there are some key features of our culture, and our research would point to these, that stymie that conversation or stifle it. One is that we tend to see vulnerability as weakness, or stoicism as strength. And that is a real cultural phenomenon that inhibits progress in this area. Reputation is so important. And I'm not saying it's not, it is important. I think it has incredibly outsized importance, especially when you talk to the everyday medical learner who's so scared of loss of face, loss of reputation, being judged when they struggle, et cetera. I mean, over and over and over, reputation comes up as a salient consideration, and judgment is feared. You know, we're a pretty judgy group of folks. I mean, we need to be honest about that. And if we think we aren't, then just open your ears to the ways that people talk about people's making mistakes or people struggling, you know, how the water cooler gossip happens. I mean, there's a lot of judgment that happens. I think we fear judgment far greater than it actually happens, but we live in a culture of fear around being judged. And the cool thing about that is that we can change that. Like, that is something we can change. Some of these other things are hard. Can't change the system in many ways, but we can change whether or not we judge or feel judged. And then finally, one in which shame is just frankly taboo. It's just an icky concept. It's not very fun to talk about or think about or admit or openly discuss. So these are headwinds. But the great thing about all of these headwinds is that they can be addressed and changed. And one of the big key steps to changing them is just to start talking about this emotion as a normal emotion. If we don't, it's going to remain hidden, right? We naturally want to hide our shame. It makes us feel imperfect and vulnerable. It can make us feel shame for feeling shame. And so the natural tendency is to try to hide it. This is especially motivated or relevant within public settings where we need to hide it from the people around us who might be judging us. Medicine is such a public learning endeavor. And then when we do perceive their judgment, it's even more sort of motivating to hide the things about which we're insecure, or the things about ourselves that we deem as unworthy. In the act of hiding that, we often engage in behaviors that bypass shame. And so there's a body of work from Donald Nathanson, who's described the shame compass, which is sets of behaviors that help us move around shame rather than through it. So it's a way of distracting from shame or avoiding it or repressing it through other behaviors. And we have a great example of that from our research of a learner who went through a very painful shame experience when he wasn't elected chief resident. He had piled just massive amounts of self-worth on that, the validation that would provide. He had limited self-worth from other sources, and so much came from how he was perceived by his peers and being seen as smart and being seen as trustworthy. And then they didn't elect him chief, and it led to a massive shame reaction. In the midst of that shame reaction, he remembered feeling, he said, quote, "I was a slave to my more primitive impulses." And he said, I just wanted to make someone else feel bad so that I could feel better. And in the middle of that sort of emotional state, he cussed out an emergency medicine attending who gave him some constructive feedback. And he did it publicly. And he went through a major remediation process that he reflected. He said, the program descended upon me rapidly later that day, which is a program director I can relate to. And that process induced his shame or exacerbated, prolonged it significantly. And it's because that process did not realize or acknowledge that there was shame behind the wall. What that environment was seeing, what the people around him were encountering, were actions, were projections of shame that were meant to hide it and work around it, even to himself. I mean, it took in this interview, half the interview, even to get him to begin acknowledging that there was shame there at all. And that's because he was trying to keep it hidden and even subconsciously hidden, and instead acting in ways that garnered really challenging responses, reactive responses, punitive responses that only deepened his shame. So the concept here is that before we react to these challenging behaviors that may induce very difficult emotional reactions in us, we've got to be able to pause and think about what could be going on, not only emotionally in this learner, but at the self-conscious emotion level. So this is a drawing that I made in just an early analysis, and we sent it off to academic medicine with the paper, and they said, this is great. It's good concept. Can you pay a professional, please, to illustrate this? And so this is what we came up with. And I think it really is an important mantra to consider as we work with challenging behaviors, especially on professional behaviors. And finally, we've come to Hannah Mumby, who's really put the icing on the cake here with her rendition. This is really, really important. And I think many of these behaviors we are likely to see during transition periods as people struggle. We need to be able to recognize them as indicative of the possibility of underlying shame, certainly not the inevitability, but the possibility. The fifth dimension I want to tell you about as I pivot to the last portion of this talk, which is what do we do about this, is the evolutionary dimension of shame. And this has been such a godsend coming to understand the evolutionary dimension for me as a shame guy, because it's hopeful. It's a hopeful dimension. It's also a very normalizing dimension. What the evolutionary dimension says, and primarily from evolutionary biology, is that we are stuck with shame for a reason. It's here in our human capacities because it's really helped us along the way as a human species. When we were out on the tundra alone, in the middle of the food chain, the thing that kept us alive was cooperation, community, collaboration. The thing that kept our genes going to the next generation was the ability to stay in relationship with people. Shame became one of the most powerful markers or signals that I was about to transgress that group's norm, or it could become the mechanism through which I was ostracized outside of that group, and then hopefully reform my behavior and came back in. It still serves very important roles in our society. In fact, I would argue that we have far too little shame in certain, actually major segments of our society right now that are presenting major problems. We need to be able to feel this, and we need to be able to regulate our social behaviors. Insofar as we do that, shame is a normal human emotion. And this is so powerful because so often we want to just dispatch with it. We want to not feel it. We want to just be shame-free. Shame-free is bad. We don't want to be shame-free. We want to be shame-engaged, shame-aware, and we want to avoid inducing it. So because shame is a human emotion, when we feel it, it at a fundamental logical level simply just means that we're human and we're not broken and we're not unworthy, but we have to do something with it and do something about it. And in so doing, shame can become a really constructive emotion. And we have data. This is amalgamated data from across our studies, not even an extensive list, where we found important, healthy outcomes in the processing of shame. Now, these were not passively achieved. It was through processing. It was through active work that these occurrences happened. And what we're really shifting our attention to now, and a lot of the work we're doing, is how do we leverage shame? So how do we leverage the shame that we're never going to get rid of while eliminating or mitigating the shame that isn't necessary in our environments? And I think this is the ultimate question that all of this poses to us. If we're going to do something about this, which now that we know about it, we have to. So I'm going to try to answer that question in the last few minutes. Check my time, perfect. So I want to acknowledge my colleague Luna here, just very intentionally. Luna is an academic philosopher at Exeter. She's just an amazing academic partner in this work and just person. She has expanded my thinking so much. And Luna's really the one that initially coined the term I'm going to tell you about very soon after which she and I began working to build an entire framework around it. So I just had to make sure Luna is acknowledged in this work. The term I'm going to tell you about is called shame competence, and this is governing the implementation work that we're doing with this topic. Shame competence is not shame resilience. It might lead to some resilience, but this is not a character trait. It's not something that you either have or you don't and you can't develop. This is a set of skills and principles and practices that we all can learn. And not only can we learn them, but we can apply them throughout our institutions. So what shame competence entails or gives us is the ability to be aware of shame, to recognize it, to avoid inducing it, and to support others and ourselves in proactively engaging with it in order to leverage its pro-social potential and mitigate its destructive potential. So this gives us a set of abilities. And we have conceptualized different levels of shame competence. And what I'm really maybe advocating for here is just the very foundational shame competence that we can start and begin implementing that I think in and of itself can be transformative. We've articulated 5 pillars of shame competence, and we do work around each one of these in terms of bringing it into an organization, a group of people, or an individual. And I'm going to interweave these 5 and what I'm going to tell you next. But if you wanted to read about them explicitly, we have a little article in the Lancet where we outline some of this in a fairly approachable, not overly wordy way that is a nice overview. The first thing I want to tell you about or suggest to you in terms of applying shame competence to support learners through their transition periods in a healthy self-conscious way. Okay, that's what these suggestions are about, is first to recognize that period as high risk for shame by virtue of the nature of that period, the uncertainties, the high stakes, the new environments, the lack of intrinsic belonging, and some of the characteristics of medical learners, them and ourselves, right? Our perfectionist tendencies, our tendency to compare to others, our mindsets and their tendency to be fixed, et cetera. Okay, so this is just a high risk period for shame. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to feel it or it's inevitable, but it's likely to occur. And if we can begin to conceptualize it that way, it means we need to begin recognizing shame and doing something about it. As a part of this acknowledgement, we also have to acknowledge the flip side of that, which is what do people need to be emotionally healthy, especially at a self-conscious level, to feel worthy. They need to feel valued, and they need to feel nurtured, and they need to feel cared for. And these are fundamental human needs that, yes, medical folks need too. Just because we can hold ourselves to higher standards, just because we can teach ourselves some emotional distance that's necessary, doesn't mean that we don't have these needs. And therefore, it means that our environments have to meet them. I don't think every medical learning environment is one that makes people feel nurtured, cared for, and valued. And in fact, I might argue that it's a minority of them that do this diffusely. I think this is a huge charge and challenge to us as folks who govern these environments. In operationalizing shame awareness, it's looking out at people, at your environments, at your programs, and thinking as they go through these experiences, how might they be feeling about themselves? Not just how are they feeling, right? How are they feeling is the more kind of superficial question that's a lot easier to answer. Right? I'm feeling frustrated or sad or happy or burned out, but how are you feeling about yourself as you go through this? And that's an important question to ask as a part of shame awareness. If someone's struggling, it's a totally okay question to say, can you tell me how you're feeling about yourself in the midst of this struggle? Not just how are you feeling? Take it to the self-conscious level and in the right level of trust, psychological safety, you'll be amazed at how ready people are to answer that question for you. We need to begin recognizing shame. This is a whole talk for another day, but there are ways that we can recognize it. It has a phenomenological profile that makes it, recognizable in the way that people talk and carry themselves, their action tendencies. You already saw some of the behaviors that can suggest the presence of shame. We have to be able to look for those, and then when we see them, consider the possibility that shame is present. Okay, so essentially we're asking for the adoption of a shame lens. It doesn't mean that lens is 100% always going to tell you that shame is there, nor should you ever assume and act upon its assumed presence. But can we begin potentially identifying it and then opening the door for it to be expressed and shared and then engaged with? And I think that's our next challenge. We need to, as the third pillar, we've got to eliminate intentional shaming from our culture. This is a long workshop I could do another day about shaming. It's the act of causing shame in another. Unfortunately, intentional shaming has been used as pedagogy for many, many, many years in medical education, and it's still used today, often with seemingly good results. The challenge is that we don't see the emotional impact that it has because the shame part of it is hidden. Lynn and I, we consider shaming to be mercurial. It's like you're working with an unstable element. You don't know how the person's going to respond to that shaming behavior. And even when it seems constructive, there's a very good chance, as one participant said, God, I wish I could have learned how to treat a pneumonia without all that emotional baggage that came with it. We also need to look critically at our structures in our organizations, in our programs, in our cultures, the way we do things, talk to one another, the way we govern ourselves, where shaming or the potential for shaming could be embedded within them. And then once we identify them, which I think is a body of work, we need to then modify them to reduce their potential to cause shame. And I think there are some really basic ways we can do this by just paying attention to our language, paying attention to the way that we frame the things we do, paying attention to how the process might be making someone feel about themselves. It's actually not that hard. You just have to apply the right lens to consider it. And then we need to stop the cycle of shaming, right? If we see others shaming, we need to call them in. We need to help educate them like, hey, there might be a better way to do this. We've got to be advocates, for stopping the intentional shaming that's around us. And then if and when we accidentally shame people, it's going to happen. We do everything right, someone still feels shame. We need to apologize and repair. I think we grossly underutilize apology in medicine and medical education. And it's really a way to humanize ourselves and to build closer bonds, even when we fall short of our standards. Last couple, we've got to support broad-based, healthy, multifocal self-esteem in our learners. And there are some uphill battles we're fighting, particularly around the ability for people to be self-expressive in authentic ways. Is a white man in medicine who presents himself in accordance with his gender identity and sexual orientation. I have massive emotional privilege when it comes to my ability to safely self-express in my environments. It's a huge privilege to not have to switch, to not have to assimilate, to not have to change myself depending on who's around or where I am. That privilege is deeply inequitably afforded in our environments, and it has huge impacts on people's sense of self-worth, and their tendency to feel shame. We have to do a better job of letting people, and then not only letting them, but celebrating them as the very diverse people they are, and then in supporting their continued maintenance of the sources of self-worth that make them those diverse and dynamic people. And then finally, we need to begin cultivating the ability to support people through shame once we recognize its presence. We need to be able to normalize learning as struggle. I really like to help people in residence, particularly junior resident students, a little harder later in residency, to really lean into the idea of being in rehearsal and not performance, because that's what they're doing. You are not performing when you're learning, you're rehearsing when you're learning. Helping them understand their experience as rehearsal can really free them up to be more imperfect, to struggle and to learn from that struggle, and not to feel shame about it, to name and validate their emotions. I can tell you're really beating yourself up here. That's an understandable way to feel, right? I've felt that. A lot of people have felt that. It actually has a name. It's called a shame response, and it's a really normal human emotion. And I know it's hard. And then to orient them away from damaging self-assessment to something specific that they can change. So I want you to stop beating yourself up for a minute. Leave yourself out of this. What did you do that needs to be improved? What did you do that led to this outcome? And how are we going to begin fixing what you did or what you thought, right? Or what happened? Sometimes it's just a circumstance that has nothing to do with the person, right? This was just a really challenging vacuum delivery and a baby who was dying in a perineum you couldn't see because there was blood everywhere. It's not because you were a bad doctor, it's because it was a hard situation. We need to highlight incremental growth over time. We're working with a generation of learners, of which I am a part, that wants to be good right away. We don't want to be incompetent, and we don't want to be incompetent for long, and medical learning just doesn't work that way. Help them see the growth over time, especially amidst the failure that can be some of the strongest catalysts of that growth. Sharing your own experiences can be so transformational, especially if you're looked to as a mentor or someone towards which people are striving to be. To say, hey, I've been through this before and it was really hard on me. Can I tell you how I went through it? Can be so humanizing. And then finally, partnering and offering consistent, sustained support. In my shame experience, I needed support for days to weeks. It was not a one and done thing. That active partnering of sharing our own experiences, of normalizing the emotion, of making it okay, and then opening the door to talk about it, not only destigmatizes it, but it allows us to begin engaging with it in proactive, constructive, community building, and connection building ways. And I think that's our ultimate charge. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention, and be glad to take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bynum. That was fabulous. Great intro to shame and some recognition of it and how we might address it in a constructive manner. What kind of questions or comments do you have for Dr. Bynum? Anybody? We had some great questions last night. We have a few minutes left.
One question just came through about going back to the previous slide. Yeah.
Yeah, this is I mean, I've done entire workshops on this set of this in one slide. So I know it's kind of a fast and furious thing. But yeah, there's a lot here.
Wonderful. Thank you for moving on back. Others, questions, comments? We've got some comments about what a great session.
Oh, Shannon, I see your hand up.
Yeah, hey.
Oh.
I'm a GYN oncologist, so I did OB for my first 4 years, so I hear you. And I know what you're talking about, and I think it might get worse in GYN oncology. How do you made kind of a comment about it being harder to reach those our learners the higher they get up in their training. And I find that that's really challenging in the surgical subspecialty, given that, we as GYN oncologists are kind of the primary surgeons, not only, but they spend a lot of time with us. And, by the time they're in their 4th year, they're feeling like they're ready. They're already doing it, and they still kind of have a lot left to learn. And I feel like there's probably a lot of this negative processing because they want to do well for us. I don't know. Do you have any tips for kind of reaching those more like advanced timeline learners? Because
No, I mean, it's a great question. I think, one of the facets of that experience that might be relevant and important here is that what is often perceived or received as someone who appears really confident, and like they don't necessarily need more advice or training or need to think about new ways to do things, is that is probably a quite curated and cultivated confidence that may not reflect what they internally actually feel, which is insecurity and doubts. And there's this kind of I hear this all the time from learners. They'll say things like, I'm not supposed to have to ask for help at this point in my training. And that suggests that not supposed to suggests that there's some sort of unwritten rule or standard that I'm supposed to be a certain way. And, shame comes from the failure to reach those standards, even if it's like a totally normal standard to fail at, right? As a 4th year, learner or surgeon, even as an early career surgeon, like you're still going to make mistakes. As a senior surgeon, because the work we do is so imperfect and so uncertain, that that discord and the tension between my impression management and what I'm actually feeling can really be a hard bridge to cross, if it's only me trying to cross it. So all that to say, if you can find ways to make it safe for them to express what they're actually doubting about themselves, and I'll tell you the ways to do that. The biggest way is to say, when I was in your shoes, I had tons of doubt. I projected confidence because I think I needed to, my patients needed me to, but in reality, I really had doubts about myself and whether I was going to be good enough at this, and I don't think we talk enough about that. Is that something that you ever go through? Or just to say, sometimes what I do is like just present some of these ideas, like, yeah, this is what shame is. I do a poll everywhere, and I say, has anybody ever felt shame as a medical trainee? And I've never had a group answer less than 90%. And that single fact is so important because it suddenly says, oh, wait, we're all feeling this, right? So then it's like, well, then let's talk about it. So you have to find inroads to make it okay for this experience to happen, even just to normalize it. And then people will start expressing these experiences. And then you can talk about what that tension is actually like. So, I mean, there's other ways I could answer this. I think the most important is just to normalize the experience as opposed to saying this isn't something you should be feeling.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Awesome. It looks like Dr. Yurick has a question. She's got her hand raised. Thank you, Dr. Armour.
Hello, I'm Lisa
Hi.
Yurick. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I was thinking in particular about the shame that happens around remediation for our trainees and how whenever we have people who have succeeded a lot in their life and then all of a sudden are not succeeding, it can feel particularly shameful, and wondered if you had any ideas on how to, address that and support them.
Yeah. Oh man. It's one of the biggest shame triggers that we've come across. And then as a program director, I've just sat in just the shame soup with learners who I've had to remediate, and some really painful remediations. The answer is there are specific things you can do within that exact interaction. And I think even more importantly, there's things you can do within your program culture. What we did in Duke Family Medicine is from day one of intern orientation, we presented our what we call performance improvement processes. We said they are remediation, but really what they're, for the vast majority of people, they're meant to make you better, right? A very small subset, or it's meant to be regulatory and get you out of the profession, if we're being honest. But the majority of the time, it really is to help you improve. And so we would say, if you find yourself on this pathway, please know and trust that we are all doing it and working our tails off to help you improve and get better. Now, the degree to which they believe that is a little bit out of your control, but to plant that seed early and say, ending up on this pathway does not mean you're broken or unworthy, that we think you suck. It means that we are investing in you to get better and that there are skills that you need to improve. And that the need to improve is a very normal part of learning. Okay, so you get to set a tone with it. And then all the language and wording around these processes need to align with that. So when we talk about it in our clinical competency committee, when we write the reports that go to GME, et cetera, we make sure there's not shaming language in there. We make sure everything aligns with performance improvement. We care about you. We're here to support you. And then within the interaction, a lot of it is just going back to what do you need to get better at? Here are the things that you're deficient in. You are not deficient yourself. You aren't the problem. It's the things you're doing that is the problem, right? And that's especially important when it's unprofessional behaviors or bad behaviors. It's not to say you're a bad kid. It's just to say you keep doing all these bad things. I mean, no one wants to be the bad kid in residency. It's a stigmatized experience. And so you have to get out ahead of that, in front of that. And sometimes it's just explicit acknowledgement. I don't see you as an unprofessional person, but damn, this thing you're doing has got to stop, right? Other people are going to start seeing you that way if you don't. There's a whole group of ways you can do that. Maybe fundamentally where all that originates is I care about you. I care about you and your experience, and I want to help you get better.
Great points. Thank you so much. So Dr. Dev, I see your hands up. I just want to acknowledge the time, and it's 1:02. Anybody who has to go can go. Dr. Dev, if you want to stay after, and anybody who wants to hear this question or the answer can certainly stay and for a few extra minutes if you'd like to do so, but feel free to leave if you need to leave. Is that okay, Dr. Bynum? Are you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm sorry for long-winded, but yeah, great question.
No, thank you so much. And I don't mind if people are not listening. No, first of all, I wanted to thank you. This is outstanding. Really, really enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
I think it's not just the trainees and whether, I think it's the culture that we live in, unfortunately. Yes, it's definitely important for our learning, but I think it even goes beyond our trainees. It goes even to the levels where we are, right? Because every day you're shamed for you're finishing this or doing that or not meeting criteria, not meeting. So a lot of it also, while we're taking this in for our learners, I think it's been really outstanding to remind ourselves that we also feel that. And then because it's been ingrained to us, just as you said, surrounding us, it's unfortunately we realize we're not doing it. We're not meaning to, but it comes out that way.
Yeah.
So I really think it's outstanding, and I think it needs to be carried beyond just our trainees, and it needs to be carried all the way through our culture, so to speak, but even, starting with, within our realm of environments and stuff. So thank you so much.
I do
Yeah,
love that I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr.
Oh,
Bynum.
no, I'll just say it's a really important point. I mean, this is not an emotion that any of us can look at from a distance. In the best way to become shame competent is to first acknowledge it in yourself. Think about it. You forgive yourself for your own sort of things you feel ashamed about, and then be prepared to support other people in going through it. I think the two most important groups, the stakeholder groups that are going to make the biggest change here, are our institutional leaders and our faculty, because there's this great mantra that someone said: if you don't transform shame, you will transfer it. And it is we do a lot of shame transference, whether we realize it or not. And instead of just saying, stop doing that, if we could first just acknowledge that we all are prone to this emotion, that it's inevitable in a lot of the work we do, and then process it healthfully, it'll be a lot less likely that we transfer it. So it's a really important point. Thank you for making it.
No, thank you. Really, really appreciate your getting us through this. This is a lovely lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I did want to acknowledge the point that when you talked about shame around needing to still ask questions, right? And I shouldn't be asking questions at this point. There's one department, one program in particular throughout our organization. I'm not going to mention them, but even though I think this is a really cool thing, where they explicitly tell their faculty, if you have any doubt, you need to ask questions. You need to call in reinforcements and ask, because this is such a high acuity field. This is so, the stakes are so high at this point with this particular specialty. And it's such a sensitive area that if you have any question, you call in reinforcements, and you should not feel bad about it at all. And they tell their faculty this, like, you have any doubts? Yeah.
Well, then if you have residents and students that are watching your faculty do that, right, they're seeing that model. But really what you're overcoming or having to overcome there is the fear of judgment. If I call and ask for help, that someone might think I'm less competent or not good enough or not worthy of their trust. You're creating a cultural norm that overcomes that stigma of asking for help. And it's amazing in doing this work, because it is such a fundamental emotion, how many times I come across these wildly paradoxical realities in our culture. One of them is that we feel shame for asking for help,
right,
in a helping profession that's incredibly hard, that no single one of us can be good enough at, that we don't ever need help. It's just
Absolutely
insane.
agree.
The other is that we mistreat learners while we teach them to become doctors. I mean, how paradoxical is that? So these paradoxes are both head scratching, but they're also like revealing, because it says, hey, this is basic stuff we can begin changing. We just need a new approach.
I love it. Awesome. Thank you so very much. Thank you all for your thought-provoking questions. And I know Dr. Bynum is totally open. If you want to contact him thereafter, feel free to reach out to us or to him directly with any sort of questions. And we will have everything up. Thank you for putting the Shame Lab in the chat. We will put that up on our website with all of the other presentation, the video, all that kind of stuff. So thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and please don't blow away.